Religion and faith are two topics that have been widely discussed in film. But although the challenges of religion are discussed frequently, depicting a religious deity is another story. It can become a difficult challenge depicting a god in the media, because if the depiction isn't one followers think is accurate or respectful, then controversies start, possibly escalating to violence. That challenge is made more difficult, however, when more than being just a character in a story, the figure is used as a reflection against religion as a whole. Despite this, directors have tried depicting various different religious figures in many different ways to varying success. Two of these films, Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ and Martin Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ, have stood the test of time and, despite varying degrees of controversy, have remained important films that discuss faith and the life of Jesus Christ. Despite this though, both films approach Jesus and his life in very different, almost opposite ways, while trying to share the same message. But before I start analyzing, I want to give some background on myself so you can contextualize my opinions and from what perspective I'm coming from. I was raised Catholic and went to a Catholic school, and although I am no longer religious, I still remember reading the Bible and everything that was taught to me at a young age. I'll analyze these films through the perspective of Christianity being the correct framework in which the world is to be interpreted through, since both directors are Catholics, and how effective each film comes across in delivering a message about faith. However, this only applies to how the film comes across in their themes and not in my personal experience of watching them. And I'll be starting off with The Passion of the Christ. So this film covers the final 12 hours of Jesus' life, from the agony in the garden to his crucifixion. There are some flashbacks to earlier moments in the New Testament, but for the most part we stay in those 12 hours. Now, the point of this movie is very much just the violence. In Christianity, it is said that Jesus, the Son of God, suffered a painful death, and that through his suffering or his passion, everyone else gains the opportunity to enter heaven. Now, as a drama, the movie very much fails on building any emotions except the ones you walked into the theater with. It's been mentioned by others, but Judas Iscariot's betrayal of Christ conjures no feelings in the audience. The point of betrayal is that it destroys trust, but if Judas is introduced as a betrayer, then the audience doesn't feel like anything unexpected is happening. And yeah, I know almost everyone in the audience knows who betrays Jesus, but knowing the future outcome of someone shouldn't prevent an audience member's emotional connection to an act of betrayal. Every single person walking in to watch Star Wars Episode 3 knew that Anakin was going to betray Obi-Wan, but because the characters and the relationships got more fleshed out, the audience still felt the emotions of what was happening. But it isn't just Judas that suffers from characterization issues, but rather the entire ensemble. Everyone seems to be the most exaggerated version of their archetype, which could work in theory with this supposedly being the most important event in existence, but again, only if there was something else connecting people with this story. Instead, everybody is just very vague, and the movie plays out watching characters that we don't really care about. Other than being the innocent victim, Jesus doesn't get much characterization. Judas is nothing more than a traitor, the Virgin Mary does nothing more than cry the whole film, Satan is nothing more but an evil-looking character in a black cloak, and the Jewish crowd that condemns him are nothing more than anti-Semitic stereotypes. And since we don't have an interesting story to focus on, we don't have compelling or intriguing characters, we're left with nothing more than the over-the-top suffering and execution. Now, I'm sure as a believer it was a very moving experience to watch your savior get sacrificed, but for everyone else, violence alone isn't enough to make a movie engaging. But Jesus' message and sacrifice is meant to be representative of so much more than how much pain God is willing to put on his son to prove his love. And as a religious work of art, it comes across as really shallow in its messaging. Now, before we get into the last temptation of Christ, I do want to be upfront and say that yes, while telling the same story as The Passion, this one is adapted out of Nico Kazanska's novel and not the Bible itself. But I'm still going to use it as an example of how the same events, person, and messages can be depicted in a more universal way. The Last Temptation of Christ also depicts the crucifixion of Jesus, but instead of solely focusing on that event, it comes instead at the very end of the movie. Instead, we start with a younger and more interesting characterization of Jesus, being that in this story, Jesus isn't sure he wants to go through with God's plan for him. He's described as being 100% man and 100% God, and it is assumed that at a young age, God or an angel must have revealed to him his plan for the future. And while the Bible and most media depicts Jesus as a man who accepted his destiny without hesitation, this one stops and asks, what about the part of him that was 100% man? This version of Jesus is one that grapples with what he knows he has to do and is scared of the pain that his future holds, which already sets the stakes of his death higher than the Passion. The stakes aren't only physical. Jesus is now scared and doesn't want to go through with this, a position that the Jesus from the Passion didn't ever really consider. But more than just Jesus' characterization, Judas, his mother, and Mary Magdalene all become more fleshed out characters that are more than stand-ins for the audience to project their biblical counterparts onto. So by the time we get to the crucifixion near the end of the movie, we've seen the relationships with Jesus grow and know what's at stake when he dies. But on the cross, Jesus gets visited by his guardian angel. She lets him know he's done good as God's son and saves him from his fate, allowing him to grow old and fall in love with Mary Magdalene. But the older he gets, the more the world and Jerusalem falls into chaos. On his deathbed, it is revealed the guardian angel that saved him was actually Satan, tricking him into not sacrificing himself. He begs with God to let him make the sacrifice, and we're back to the moment of his death. As Jesus dies, he accepts that this is what he must do and willingly gives up a future life filled with those he loves. In this sense, Jesus' sacrifice isn't one of physical suffering that he endures because it's his destiny, but rather an emotional loss that he chooses to go through out of love for the world. And ultimately, it all comes down to the different approaches in telling this story. If I had to guess, I'd assume that Mel Gibson tried to make the Passion as close to what's written in the Bible as possible, but interpreted the events in its most simplistic form, being that Jesus suffered so that we could go to heaven, so let's honor that suffering. The problem with this idea, though, is that it only interprets the final chapter in a much longer story, so we lose a lot of vital information. I understand that the idea is that you're already supposed to be connected with these characters, but judging it as a film, the idea is inherently flawed. It would be like if a filmmaker decided to interpret Game of Thrones, but only make a movie about the last episode where Daenerys loses her shit and burns a city down. Yeah, it looks really violent and cool, but without all the build-up, the audience can't feel the sheer fucking disappointment of being let down after watching 8 seasons. But taking The Last Temptation into account, I'd assume Scorsese, Schrader, and Kazantzakis all took the ideas presented about a character who is scared but forced to give up his future to die a violent death in order to save humanity, and go from there. And although it doesn't follow the Bible word for word, it paints a more realistic and spiritual message found at the end of the film. It also adds a bit to the fact that although anyone can watch any of these movies, I'm sure more people can actually enjoy The Last Temptation even though Jesus and the Christian faith mean nothing to them. You get brought through an emotional journey with the main character, and how they eventually choose to make the ultimate sacrifice. In The Passion, there's nothing deeper to be understood. And that's all I gotta say. If you haven't noticed yet, I clearly do prefer The Last Temptation over The Passion of Christ because that movie is essentially anti-Semitic torture porn. If you strip away all the religious symbolism of the movie, it essentially does boil down to a story of how one man is betrayed, then tortured for 2 hours, and then killed with an extreme emphasis on the violence he endures. Needless to say, I did not enjoy watching The Passion of the Christ twice for this video, so definitely check out The Last Temptation instead and give this video a like if you enjoyed it. Peace.